The Drew Corp. Manager Lauren's mind flickered to the name, heavy with its reputation. One of the top 300 most successful companies in the nation. Its weight wasn't just in business. It was in every whispered conversation, every networking event across California. And Ruth Martin? Another daughter of affluence. Lauren had dealt with her type before. Entitled, influential, untouchable. Paired with Sophia Drew, the odds in this room were glaringly lopsided. Lauren's internal debate raged. Do I follow the rules or play along? The tension knotted in his chest. One wrong move, and it's my career on the line. His thoughts shattered as Helen's voice cut through the air like a blade. That's enough, she snapped, her tone sharp and uncompromising. All eyes turned toward her, including Lauren's. Her hands were clenched into fists, her fiery gaze darting between Ruth, Sophia, and the hesitant manager. The room seemed to still for a moment, held captive by the sheer force of her defiance. You think you're untouchable just because of your connections? Helen's voice rose, dripping with disdain. She shifted her attention to Lauren, her tone slicing through his composure. Are you seriously going to let them walk all over people who made a proper reservation? Lauren swallowed hard, his hands fidgeting with the edge of the desk. Ladies, I assure you, he began, his voice faltering under Helen's glare. We'll resolve this amicably. Let me check with the staff to see if any accommodations can be made. Sophia's lips curled into a practiced smile, her composure momentarily faltering before she recovered. Ruth leaned in, sensing an opportunity to press their advantage. So, Manager Lauren, Ruth purred, her voice laced with mock politeness. Do we have a room now? Lauren hesitated, the beads of sweat on his brow betraying his unease. His gaze darted nervously between the two groups. Finally, he straightened, forcing a strained smile that did little to hide his discomfort. Yes, of course, Miss Martin, he said, his tone lacking conviction. I just remembered. He glanced briefly at Helen before turning back to Ruth. I had already reserved a private room for Miss Baker and her guests before Miss Jones contacted me. The statement hung heavy in the air, drawing a gasp from nearby patrons who were watching the scene unfold. Lauren shifted his weight uncomfortably, knowing his excuse was paper-thin. Turning to Helen, his voice softened with false regret. I'm terribly sorry, Miss Jones, but I'm afraid I can't accommodate you tonight. Perhaps another time? Helen's eyes blazed, her knuckles whitening as her fists tightened. Before she could respond, Susan stepped forward, her gaze sharp and unyielding. Do you take us for fools, Manager Lauren? She asked, her voice calm but edged with steel. Helen took a step closer, rolling up her sleeves. Do you think you can bully us like this? One call to my brother, and this prestigious restaurant of yours will be shut down faster than you can blink. Sophia's practiced grin widened as she interjected smoothly. Don't worry, Manager Lauren. We'll take full responsibility for any inconveniences. Please go ahead and handle this. Sophia's words seemed to bolster Lauren. Straightening his back, he addressed Helen with renewed firmness. Miss Jones, I'm just an employee here. Threats won't change the situation. Now, please leave immediately and stop disturbing the other guests. The finality in his tone stoked Helen's rage. Her eyes darted around the room until they landed on a decorative vase perched nearby. Without hesitation, she grabbed it and hurled it to the ground. The vase shattered into 1,000 pieces, the sound ringing sharply through the restaurant. Gasp echoed around the room as Helen raised her chin defiantly. If I can't eat here, no one else will either. Manager Lauren's face twisted with frustration. His voice was sharp and commanding as he barked at the staff. Get them out of here. Before Susan or Helen could react, several burly servers approached, their movements swift and unyielding. Helen struggled against their grip, her voice rising in protest. Let go of us! Susan, in her heels, lost her footing as she was yanked forward. She fell hard onto the cold, smooth tiles, her knees scraping painfully. Her breath hitched as humiliation swelled in her chest. Stop! You're hurting her! Helen's voice broke with desperation, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. A server grabbed Susan by the arm, pulling her roughly to her feet. Move, one of them barked, shoving her toward the exit. Susan's cheeks burned as the weight of onlookers' stares pressed against her like a physical force. She felt the cracks in her dignity widening with each shove, her pride slipping through the fractures. Just as she reached the doorway, a deep, commanding voice sliced through the air like a blade. What the hell is going on here? The words were calm, yet they carried an undeniable weight of authority. The servers froze mid-action, their grip slackening. Susan's heart skipped a beat, the voice igniting a flicker of hope and dread in equal measure. Before she could fully process what was happening, one of the servers released her with a final push. She stumbled forward, her eyes darting toward the source of the voice. There, approaching with deliberate steps, was a tall figure radiating quiet power. Ethan. Susan's breath hitched as her eyes met his. Ethan. He was the last person she expected to see, especially in her current state. Her chest tightened, torn between relief and dread. Why was he here? Earlier that day, at Ethan's villa, the morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Ethan's sleek living room. Felix Knight stood by the edge of the couch, his hands clasped behind his back, his usual calm demeanor tinged with unease. "Sir," Felix began, his voice measured but cautious. "I have information about Mrs. Susan's whereabouts after she left last night." Ethan, seated on the leather armchair, didn't look up immediately. His eyes were fixed on the tablet in his hands, but his brow furrowed at Felix's tone. Finally, he raised his gaze, cold and expectant. "Go on." Felix hesitated only briefly. "She was dropped off at a 5-star hotel by Michael Harrington. You might recognize the name. He's from the Harrington family." The mention of another man drew an immediate reaction. Ethan's jaw clenched and his eyes sharpened. "So she ran to him?" His tone was clipped, cutting through the air like a blade. "I suppose I was right to handle things the way I did." Felix shook his head. "Actually, sir, that's not the case." He stepped forward slightly, his voice firm but careful. "Michael helped the young madam from a messy situation and left shortly after dropping her off. I reviewed the surveillance footage myself." Ethan's frown deepened and he leaned back, his expression unreadable. Felix continued, his voice steady. "Mrs. Susan checked into a budget hotel afterwards. It seems..." He paused, choosing his words. "The Drew family has frozen her accounts. She's been forced to rely on her own resources." Ethan's fingers drummed against the armrest, his eyes narrowing as Felix added, "She's been the subject of some unkind discussions in elite circles. The pressure on her is substantial." For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint sound of the waves crashing outside the villa. Ethan stood abruptly, pacing the length of the living room. The image of Susan dragging her suitcase through dimly lit streets flashed in his mind. "Damn it," he muttered, his voice low but laced with frustration. He paused mid-step, rubbing the back of his neck. The guilt was subtle but persistent, creeping into the edges of his thoughts. "Was I too harsh?" he asked aloud, though the question seemed more to himself than to Felix. Felix remained silent, his professionalism unwavering. Ethan exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if to dispel the thought. "No," he said, almost convincing himself. She knew what she was getting into. Yet the unease lingered, a faint whisper in the back of his mind. Back at the restaurant, Ethan's eyes bore into the servers who had been gripping Susan moments before. His voice, low and controlled, cut through the tension like a knife. "Is this how your restaurant treats its customers?"
To listen to the full audio series, install the Pocket FM app now.